106 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. We don't have any of them. Please address all comments through the chair. A quick reminder before we proceed, I simply want to remind members to be very careful when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbour's microphone is turned on. Earpieces placed too close to a microphone are one of the most common causes of sound feedback, which is extremely harmful to interpreters and causes serious injury. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on June 16, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of population sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks. On our first panel today, we are welcoming from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Steve Gotch, Senior Director Operations Pacific Region, and Wes Shoemaker, Executive Head Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. Thank you both for taking the time to appear today. You will have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Mr. Gotch, you have the floor. 5 minutes or less, please.
Bonjour and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. As introduced, my name is Steve Gotch, and I am the Pacific Region Senior Director of Operations with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I'm accompanied here today by my colleague, Mr. Wes Shoemaker, Head of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Transformation Initiative. We appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee on behalf of the department this afternoon. Following my opening remarks, we look forward to answering any questions regarding Pacific salmon stocks in the Yukon and associated departmental policies, strategies, programs, and services. As committee members likely recognize, the presence of Pacific salmon stocks in the Yukon have been integral to the environment and sustainment of people for thousands of years. Many populations of Pacific salmon in Yukon represent the northernmost range for this species. Unlike other Pacific salmon stocks, which inhabit more southern and temperate regions of Western North America, over millennia, salmon stocks in the Yukon have adapted to survive in often harsh subarctic conditions. As a result, many of these stocks represent the longest lived and largest body size of their species, in many cases enabling them to migrate several thousands of kilometers inland from the ocean to access spawning areas in freshwater habitats. Fisheries and Oceans Canada is responsible for monitoring the abundance of anadromous stocks of salmon in the Yukon and work closely with self-governing Yukon First Nations to coordinate the administration of First Nations subsistence, recreational and commercial fisheries for Pacific salmon. Given the reality that all of the watershed inhabited by Pacific salmon in the Yukon, including the Yukon, Porcupine, and Alsek watersheds are situated, the lower portions are situated in the United States, Fisheries and Oceans Canada engages directly with state and federal fishery management agencies in Alaska to coordinate assessment and management of these stocks. This engagement also involves working together to implement formal processes and requirements established within the international U.S.-Canada Pacific Salmon Treaty. Over the most recent 25-year period, Pacific salmon stocks have exhibited significant change in both abundance and condition across British Columbia and Yukon. In the case of the Alsek River watershed in southwestern Yukon, certain seasons have experienced some of the highest returning abundance of adult sockeye and coho salmon to Canada, while in the Yukon River watershed, Chinook and chum salmon stocks continue to decline to levels not recorded in living memory. For Yukon River Chinook salmon, this decline has been particularly profound, with recent annual abundance representing only 10% of what was typically observed prior to 1995. The sustained decline over multiple life cycles of this species has not only resulted in profound effects on the Yukon River ecosystem, but has created significant hardship for the people who rely on Pacific salmon as a consistent source of food, for ceremony, and as an integral part of culture. In response to the declines observed, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, in collaboration with Yukon First Nation governments and U.S. and state and federal agencies, have undertaken numerous initiatives to improve our understanding of the abundance and health of Pacific salmon stocks in the Yukon. These monitoring and research efforts, in parallel with restriction and ultimately closure of Canadian fisheries, are intended to conserve and protect adult salmon returning to their spawning grounds. Concurrently, measures undertaken to preserve and protect Pacific salmon habitats from anthropogenic development serve to ensure that the ecological integrity of areas that Pacific salmon rely on the most remain intact. The continued decline of Yukon River Chinook salmon has recently led to collaborative efforts undertaken by Fisheries and Oceans Canada and self-governing First Nations to explore measures of last resort. In most extreme examples, faced with only a handful of adult salmon returning to salmon spawning areas. Oh, Mr. Chair, I apologize. A bit of a connection issue. On April 1st of this year, following months of intensive negotiations, Fisheries and Oceans Canada reached a historical agreement with the state of Alaska, which commits the governments to implement measures to protect and recover Canadian origin salmon stocks. The agreement involves the immediate suspension of all fisheries which target Canadian origin Chinook salmon stocks in the Yukon, and confirms the parties' intent to support scientific, technical, and traditional knowledge research into the causes for decline, and also commits the parties to development of an international stock rebuilding plan through the Yukon River Panel. This agreement will remain in effect for a 7-year period, which is representative of one life cycle of Canadian origin Yukon River salmon, and at its foundation reflects the necessary actions identified by Yukon First Nations, people who have firsthand experienced the effects of decline of Yukon River Chinook salmon for over 2 decades. We acknowledge and thank the committee for undertaking this study and look forward to responding to any questions you may have regarding Pacific salmon stocks in Yukon. Mr. Chair.
Now we'll go to Mr. Shoemaker for 5 minutes or less, please.
He doesn't have, it's only Mr. Gotch.
Okay, Sonny.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I do not have any opening remarks.
Okay, not a problem. I just heard that from the clerk, just told me that. So we'll go right to our rounds of questioning. We'll go to Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the department officials for being here today for this. I'm not sure which one of you is best to answer this, but what measures have been taken to protect the Yukon and Alsek River salmon in the marine environment? We understand there's been the moratorium on the non-tidal in the river, but what measures have been taken by DFO in the marine environment?
Mr. Chair, if I may, the marine areas that are primarily inhabited by Canadian origin Yukon River salmon stocks are, in fact, U.S. exclusive economic zone waters. So the vast majority of marine habitats inhabited by Yukon and arguably Alsek River salmon stocks as well are directly regulated and controlled by the state of Alaska or U.S. federal agencies.
I think we understand that, but what measures has DFO taken to protect those stocks in the marine environment? What negotiations have taken place with the U.S.?
I see. Mr. Chair, so one of the specific measures that Fisheries and Oceans Canada has been involved in is undertaking negotiations with state and federal agencies around minimizing and, where possible, avoiding bycatch of Canadian origin salmon stocks in U.S. groundfish fisheries, both in the North Pacific as well as the Bering Sea and Aleutian Island fishery areas. As far as Pacific salmon fisheries, directed fisheries in the marine environment, state or federal agencies do not currently permit directed harvest of Chinook salmon in offshore, we'll call it marine high seas areas, Mr. Chair.
And how much, what biomass of the Chinook salmon would be caught as bycatch? Even though they're not permitted, there must be bycatch. How much is caught?
Mr. Chair, on an annual basis, the percentage of total abundance, in particular of Canadian origin Yukon River Chinook salmon that are caught in biomass in U.S. marine fisheries is approximately between 1% and 3%, which is representative in a rough number, approximately 500 to 750 individual salmon, Mr. Chair.
And how much difference would those 500 to 750 fish make on the spawning grounds? How many eggs would those fish produce per fish?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So currently, the Chinook salmon stocks in the Yukon are representative of approximately 50% males and 50% females, roughly speaking, on an average basis. So out of, we'll say, 500 fish, approximately 250 of those fish are females. And what we do know from the most recent spawner recruit analyses, that we're seeing approximately one or less than one adult fish returning for spawner. So 250 additional female fish on the spawning grounds would represent approximately 250 returning adults, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Can you tell the committee what results have been achieved on the ground through the resources of the Pacific Strategic Salmon Initiative?
Mr. Chair, happy to begin. So there have been several investments over the past 3 years in the areas of monitoring, research, and restoration, focusing on Canadian origin salmon stocks in the Yukon River watershed. Approximately better part of $1 million has been directed specifically towards First Nation government organizations that have undertaken enhanced monitoring, so observing the number of adult fish returning to spawning grounds, undertaking some habitat assessment studies to identify potential areas for restoration works in the near future. And then most prominently, investments have been made through partnership with one particular First Nation who are exploring the development of a stewardship and restoration center in the Upper Yukon River watershed, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my question now to Mr. Shoemaker. I believe you've been around, you've certainly, I believe, appeared to this committee previously. Members of this committee take seriously our work and hearing from questioning of the department officials, and especially appreciate that you're here. We also honor the time that all the witnesses take out of their lives to provide testimony as we develop and present comprehensive reports to government out of this committee based on the evidence we hear from people like yourself and the witnesses. And yet, time and again, the recommendations in those reports are given little more than lip service by the Fisheries Minister and the Department. Recommendations that could make the lives better for harvesters, recommendations that would rebuild and protect the biodiversity of Canada's marine environment. Can you explain to the committee members here today why we should believe this minister or her department will respond any differently to any recommendations coming out of this study on Pacific salmon?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Guess what I can say is the number of activities and investments that are undertaken towards addressing not only the sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks, but Pacific salmon stocks more generally. And, given the significant investment and commitment towards the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, I am very, very optimistic that not only our efforts and the investments undertaken thereof, and or the involvement of our other partners and recommendations that come from either different reports or our partners are going to make a difference with regards to the conservation and protection of both Yukon and Pacific salmon. So again,
if I can interject here.
Time, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much. I just confirming my microphone is on. Thank you very much for both appearing today and for contributing to this really important study. Obviously, an incredibly important study to me as the Member of Parliament for the Yukon, but also a very important study for, I would say, the entire continent, because we're talking about an ecosystem that is at risk and a species that is at risk. So I wanted to start with maybe following up on a couple of Mr. Arnold's questions. Mr. Gotch, you talk about the scale of the bycatch, and could you comment further on because I hear a lot about bycatch as being, a significant contribution to the decline of the salmon. Can you talk about how confident you are in those numbers and the source of those numbers that you relate to the, what amounts to 500 to 750 individual salmon?
Mr. Chair, so I'll begin by responding that bycatch in Bering Sea and Aleutian Island commercial fisheries is identified through a highly regulated monitoring program that's administered through state and federal agencies in Alaska. And the specific requirements of all vessels fishing groundfish, which are also described as pollock or cod in the Bering Sea, is that each vessel must have at least one independent observer, which documents catch that's brought on board vessels that are actively participating in fishing activities. The non-target species are enumerated and identified by species, and genetic tissue samples are taken for further analysis to determine the stock of origin in the case of Pacific salmon. With respect to our degree of confidence in the bycatch reporting in Bering Sea, Aleutian Island groundfish fisheries by the United States, I would classify it as extremely high on the basis of the rigor and the specific requirements of those monitoring programs. The analyses and the results presented on bycatch information are provided by U.S. state representatives from Alaska through the International Yukon River Panel process and are published as a component of an annual publication produced by the Yukon River Panel's Joint Technical Committee. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that question. And I wonder whether you could elaborate briefly on other marine factors that may be contributing to the decline.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as other factors beyond groundfish fisheries and bycatch in groundfish fisheries, as I had mentioned previously, there are no directed fisheries for Pacific salmon in the Bering Sea beyond nearshore fisheries that occur in the case of Yukon River salmon stocks at the mouth of the Yukon River and are documented and enumerated as part of, we'll call it, broader U.S. or Alaskan catch. From our best available information currently, the largest influencing factor, most prominent influencing factor on the survival and abundance of Canadian origin Yukon River Chinook salmon stocks has been changing marine conditions. And specifically the conditions are earlier and later ice breakup on the Bering Sea, reduced period of ice cover, which affects water temperature as well as salinity. And effectively, these changing conditions are creating an environment that is more conducive to supporting different types of species that serve as food for fish, and in particular salmon, but then also attracts different species of predators. To the best of our understanding, these primary shifts as far as Chinook salmon survival and production go are related to food availability, so different types and frankly different quality of foods that are available for Chinook salmon that are in the marine environment in the Bering Sea, and then also indication of increased predation rates, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, I'm obviously pleased, as many are in the territory, and I believe in Alaska as well, to see the arrival at the 7-year moratorium. And I wonder if, obviously there's a lot to unpack there within that 7-year agreement. But can you or perhaps Mr. Schumacher, perhaps you could comment on the funding, additional to PSSI funding, that that I believe is referred to within this agreement. Is there funding that will help to support the restoration activities that are described in the 7-year agreement?
Mr. Chair, I'll begin, and perhaps Mr. Shoemaker can add to my response. So I'll answer it twofold. Firstly, the 7-year agreement recently signed by Canada and the state of Alaska refers to two potential sources of funding. Firstly, U.S. funding leveraged through the state of Alaska, which is very relevant to Canada because the intent of that funding is to be directed towards the conservation and rebuilding of Canadian origin salmon stocks. So although it would occur through a U.S. appropriation, and be made available, so to speak, in U.S. funds, the specific intention and direction of those funds would be for Canadian stocks and for projects, frankly speaking, in the Canadian portion of the Yukon River watershed. As far as additional efforts being undertaken by Canada to seek increased federal funding or secure new funding to assist with Yukon River habitat and stock restoration activities, those are efforts that are currently underway, and we will be hopefully reporting out in the near future on progress achieved in that regard. But as far as this point in time, and as far as perhaps Budget 2024 announcements go, there is no specific funding earmarked beyond PSSI, Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative funds, for this particular initiative, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shoemaker.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. We'll now go to Madam Debian for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos...
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. It's always very important to have witnesses with us. And of course, Quebec is a bit far from the Pacific coast, but Mr. Hanley, I'd like to thank him for starting this study. But I'd like to understand the behavior of salmon with regard to Atlantic salmon. And do you have any information on the Atlantic salmon population? Or are you more specialized in the Pacific salmon in order to coordinate my questions?
I'll attempt to respond initially. Perhaps my colleague, Mr. Shoemaker, may be able to add. In respect of specialization or any information I can provide on Atlantic salmon, what I can confirm is that not in recorded history have Atlantic salmon been documented, either in, we'll say, the North Pacific, to the extent where Yukon Alsek River origin Pacific salmon stocks would occur, and likewise in the Yukon River watershed nor adjacent marine areas. So to the best of any information on hand or information available to us, at least in the context of the North Pacific and Bering Sea, we have not identified any occurrence of Atlantic salmon in these regions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, what I might add to my colleague's answer is that we are very much in conversation with our colleagues to, quote, compare notes on the comprehensive approach that we are taking with respect to Pacific salmon, which has historically only been focusing on harvest-related decisions, but instead taking a more broader and comprehensive approach all around habitat and hatcheries and harvest-related things, and how we integrate and collaborate with others. And certainly we've made investments and are learning a lot about the new scientific measures that are required to try and understand what are some of the climate change impacts, along with perhaps a more conservation-oriented approach to how we are using salmon enhancement on the West Coast. And no one thing is going to help us, turn the corner with respect to the increased health and abundance of Pacific salmon, but it's going to take a lot of different actions. And to that end, as we learn as we go in building this very comprehensive strategy and working with partners, I think there are lessons to be learned and shared with our colleagues on the East Coast with respect to Atlantic salmon. So again, I think there is good and close collaboration, and albeit we're talking different species, I think many of the actions that are necessary will be similar.
Merci, c'est très éclairant.
Thank you very much. It's very useful. And so with regard to climate change, which are often cited as a problem, this is not the other factor. And climate change isn't something that's just happened yesterday. I mean, we've been talking about the climate change in particular for 30 years. And in fact, is the rapidity with which climate change is happening, does that have any effect on the fish resources, or is that something that was forecast, or is it, or were your predecessors, were they concerned by this climate change and rapid climate change? But now it seems like we're almost taken by surprise, and the resources relative to that.
Mr. Chair, as far as the rate and pace of climate change goes, was there awareness that climate was changing through, we'll say, large-scale global influencing factors over the past 30 years? I would answer yes. The rate and pace that change is being observed in northern environments, in particular the Canadian Arctic, is perhaps far more accelerated than anticipated. As far as the resulting influence on fish and wildlife species, and in particular salmon, it's a complicated question and perhaps even more complicated response. That being that our observations, certainly over the last decade or more, is that certain species of Pacific salmon are in fact finding that changes to environmental conditions, in particular in freshwater environments, are becoming more favorable. And their abundance is in fact increasing, as what we're seeing with sockeye salmon in southwest Yukon, as well as in central and northwestern Alaska. On the contrary, other species of Pacific salmon seem to be faring much more poorly, such as Chinook and chum salmon. The final point I will make with regards to influencing factors with respect to climate change and responses from Pacific salmon is that we are observing certainly a far further eastern migration of Pacific salmon stocks through the Arctic, through Arctic waters, to the extent where it's becoming relatively common to observe Pacific salmon showing up in the eastern Arctic, and I understand even the northernmost reaches of the Atlantic. So if we were to predict over the coming years what might happen, new and different habitats will likely become available to Pacific salmon in the far north subarctic, and we do expect that some Pacific salmon distribution will likely change over the coming years and decades, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Desbiens. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses, Mr. Gotcha and Mr. Shoemaker. As we know, there are 14 Yukon nations and 11 of them which have signed modern treaties. And we had, I believe her name was Chief Nicole Tom, that was here from the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, who brought to us her concerns on behalf of the nation of the Yukon salmon populations of Canadian origins being at a historic all-time low, and brought to the committee some strong recommendations and steps forward. And so with the news that we have since this witness, I wanted to go through and see if some of these factors were addressed in the steps that have been taken to date. I guess the very first thing is if you can share what it's looked like to have what the involvement has been of First Nations in part of these negotiations for this new agreement.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So as far as negotiations between Canada and Alaska are concerned in regards to the establishment of the 7-year agreement, the Canadian delegation led by myself received advice and guidance from representatives from each of the respective 11 Yukon self-governing nations, inclusive of, in particular, engagements with Chief Tom directly. As far as some of the recommendations and advice coming forward from Yukon First Nations and how those are or perhaps are not captured in the 7-year agreement, in my view, the fundamental elements that Yukon First Nations have been bringing forward to the governments of Canada and the United States form the basis of the agreement, namely to acknowledge the historic low abundance of Chinook salmon in recent years through a very rigorous and frankly strongly committing closure of fisheries for a 7-year period. And these are commercial, recreational, and domestic as well as personal use fisheries. The significance of a 7-year closure is going to have profound effects on people throughout the Yukon River watershed, many of which obviously reside in rural communities such as the community of Carmacks, Yukon, which is Chief Tom's community, home community. As far as other elements that Yukon First Nation government representative has sought, that is to adopt or embrace a much more conservative approach to managing fisheries, i.e. The abundance at which, levels at which fisheries are considered to be self-sustaining, or fish stocks, considered to be self-sustaining and can provide opportunities for harvest. This 7-year agreement arguably almost doubles the conservation threshold where any fishery opportunities would be provided. Thirdly, and probably very importantly, the agreement acknowledges the absolute essential cultural and traditional connections between Indigenous people and salmon, and in any such arrangement, there needs to be consideration for maintaining connections between the people and the salmon over the course of this 7-year period. And then perhaps 2 final points I'd like to highlight. Firstly, is the incorporation of traditional knowledge in decision-making. A specific element of the 7-year agreement is for the parties to provide a space and a platform to receive traditional knowledge to inform future management regimes. And then finally, the commitment to a long-term rebuilding strategy to help recover Pacific salmon stocks in the Upper Yukon River watershed, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gotch. One of the specific items that Chief Tom discussed is right in line with what you're talking about right now around the traditional knowledge. But specifically, there was a point made around requiring the inclusion of traditional knowledge in guiding decisions when it comes to establishing, discussing, and reviewing spawning escapement goals. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Mr. Chair, yes. So without perhaps getting into too many nuanced details, the 7-year agreement recently announced was the culmination of a multi-year process undertaken by the Government of Canada and the United States to establish new conservation objectives, so new spawning escapement objectives for Canadian origin Chinook salmon stocks. Canada's approach over the past decade has been to comprise its delegation involved with that work through arguably a majority of Yukon First Nation government advisors, as well as representatives from territorial and federal governments in Yukon. And in doing so, that is one mechanism where we're creating a place and a space for, if you will, a conduit for traditional and local ecological knowledge to be brought forward as part of Canadian delegation submissions. Secondly, through the International Yukon River Panel process, Canada has spearheaded the initiation of a traditional knowledge advisory committee to be comprised of both Canadian and U.S. representatives to put forward recommendations to the International Yukon River Panel on not only spawning escapement objectives, but future management of the species, Mr. Chair.
12 seconds. Okay, thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gotch, according to the Canadian Wildlife Federation, the 8 biggest threats to Yukon River Chinook are: number 1, harvesting; number 2, climate change; barriers to upstream migration; juvenile turbine mortality; hatchery operations; disease and parasites; spawning habitat conditions; and predation. This was released in 2016. Do you agree?
Mr. Chair, I'm not familiar with the specific report, but those factors do seem to capture all of the elements to consider, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gotch, why do you think it's taken 8 years? That information's been publicly available for 8 years. Why is it taking 8 years for this government to start rebuilding measures on the Yukon River for Chinook?
Mr. Chair, the decline of Yukon River Chinook salmon has arguably had about occurred over a 25-year period. So as early as 1999, we saw a very significant decline in abundance returning to the upper Yukon River watershed. That was followed by a period, albeit brief, of an improvement in abundance. So we saw a very rapid decline through 1999, 2000, and then a sudden increase in abundance through perhaps 2003 up until about 2008, to the point where the perceptions at the time were the decline was short-lived in nature and emblematic of changes in abundance of Pacific salmon over time. Post-2010, however, there has been a much more sustained continuation of declining abundance. And in 2013, on the advice of Yukon First Nation governments, Fisheries and Oceans Canada began implementing temporary suspensions, and then followed by long-term closures of Canadian fisheries on the Yukon River. And arguably by 2016-17, U.S. federal and state management agencies followed suit, because by this time we saw that the decline was not short-lived, Mr. Chair.
So with these runs of Yukon River Chinook being so critically low, how important is it to protect every fish?
Mr. Chair, with the abundance observed over the past 2 years, where we saw fewer than 15,000 adult fish returning to their spawning grounds in Canada, understanding that our minimum spawning threshold is 42,500, at least at the time. So 30% of minimum spawning requirements. Yes, in years like that, every last fish does make a difference.
Well, so will there be any fishing for Chinook on the Yukon River in any part of that river this summer?
Mr. Chair, determination around any opportunities for fisheries will be contingent on actual abundance that we observe in season. As far as the forecast for the 2024 season goes, it is extremely poor. We're expecting that perhaps fewer than 20,000 fish may return.
Thank you, Mr. Botch. I'm going to turn the remainder of my time over to MP Arnold, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to just take a quick moment to introduce the motion put on notice on April 12th, 2024. Whereas the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and Canadian Coast Guard has declined 5 requests from the committee since February 6, 2004 to appear and answer questions on important matters related to her portfolio, I move that the committee requests that the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard provide the committee with dates on which she is available to appear 3 times at the committee to answer questions regarding, number 1, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development's 2023 report on monitoring marine fisheries, number 2, main estimates 2024 to 2025, and 3, on the criteria used by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to set redfish fishing quotas. I move.
Right. The motion has been moved. Any discussion? Mr. Kellaway.
Would like to put forward an amendment to the motion if I can. So we're looking at removing decline 5 requests from the committee and replacing it with appeared before the committee as often as 2 previous Conservative fishery ministers while holding the office for less than a year. After the word portfolio, add and given that the committee agreed to the subcommittee's schedule, which includes 1 additional meeting with the minister, add and given that Conservative members chose not to ask a single question on supplementary estimates to the minister when she attended committee on the supplementary estimates, and given that the committee underscored the importance of completing important studies. Remove, provide the committee with dates on which she is available to appear 3 times at the committee to answer questions regarding 1, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development's 2023 report on monitoring marine fisheries, 2, main estimates 2024, 2025, and 3, on the criteria used by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to set redfish quotas. And finally, replace with the following: work with the chair of the committee to find a suitable time to appear before the committee in alignment with the adopted subcommittee scheduling report, to meet explicitly on the subject agreed upon in the subcommittee report, and so she can surpass the previous two Conservative fishery ministers from the Harper era in attendance before the committee. And we have this both in English and French.
Okay, Ms. Barron had her, not Ms. Barron, Madame Debienne had her hand up.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, je m'excuse, c'est que l'interprète nous signe.
Sorry, but the interpreter says that he does not have the text of the motion amendments, and it's very difficult to get a correct or a proper or complete translation.
Was it supplied in both languages? What? Yeah. Okay, the amendment is in both official languages. Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think if you look at this closely as chair, you'll see that the amendment significantly changes the intent of the original motion, should be declared out of order.
Do you want to respond, Mr. Callaway?
This is your decision.
Yeah, but it's part of the debate, Mr. Arnold. I just thought the mover of the amendment might want to respond to it.
I think that, the intent is implicit in the amendment.
Okay.
Nothing more to add at this time.
All right, Mr. Small.
Mr. Chair, I move a motion to end debate and to and a vote on the main motion.
I think we got to vote on the amendment first.
Well, on the amendment first. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. All right, Madam Clerk, if you could take the, Mr. Morrissey.
We're clear. You have, did you make a ruling on the amendment?
Yes, I think the amendment is satisfactory to the original motion. So now we're going to vote on the amendment, and then, depending if it passes or not, we'll vote on the main motion.
We have a motion to end debate.
Oh, we have a motion to end debate.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the amendment?
Okay. Do we want to record a vote and end of debate?
Mr. Chair, just a clarification, please.
Yes.
So there was an amendment put on the table by Mr. Callaway. Isn't it the case that we should vote on the amendment? Why are we voting to adjourn debate?
Yeah.
It's a dilatory motion, so we'll vote on the end debate first, I guess.
Can we just suspend for 2 minutes, Mr. Chair?
Yes, I'll give you 2 minutes tops. Okay, we're back. So now we have the vote and motion to adjourn debate, moved by Mr. Small. No, and the main motion. So I'll ask the clerk to do a recorded division. No, and the motion is what he moved. That's what he moved. No, the motion.
On the main motion.
And the,
On the main motion.
and the motion. And the motion, not on the amendment.
We're voting on.
He said, and the motion during debate.
Correct that you think? So,
Yes.
Which we go right to vote?
Yep.
No debate?
Yep.
Je voudrais signaler avec
I'd like to point out that the interpretation service is very patient, but when there are 2 or 3 mics open, they can't really follow the conversation. We're going to lose time because we don't really know what we're doing. So I just wanted to remind you to make sure your mic is off if you're not speaking.
The motion to end debate moved by Mr. Small first. Then, depending if it passes or not, we'll go to the amendment from Mr. Callaway, and then the main motion either as amendment or as it was originally presented. No. No. It closes off the debate.
Well, we have to resume debate to continue on the main motion or in the amendment.
Yes, okay.
So if it's end debate. To end debate.
Mr. Arnold moved the motion to.
Yes. Sorry.
Made an amendment to that motion. Mr. Small moved the motion to end debate
Yes.
on the original motion.
Yes.
Is it both?
Yeah, both. He said both. I heard him.
Anyway, so
Go. Sorry.
you vote
There we
on
go.
the Mr. Small's motion first. I'll ask the clerk to do the vote.
Monsieur Cormier.
Oui.
Pour ajourner le débat sur la motion.
OK, parfait. Merci.
Mr. Hanley.
Yes.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Yes.
Mr. Morrissey.
Yes.
Mr. Arnold.
Yes.
Mr. Epp.
I'm very confused.
Yes. That's okay. Yes.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Small.
He had water in his gasoline that time.
Mr. Small.
Yes.
Madame Desbiens. Ms. Barron.
Yes.
Okay, unanimous. Okay, now we move back to the amendment as presented by Mr. Callaway.
No.
No? It's suspended?
We go back to witnesses.
Yeah.
Okay, we go back to witnesses. All right. Yeah. So we haven't got a second panel?
Yeah. It's past the time.
Yeah. Actually, we have to go to our next panel of witnesses now because we've expired. We've gone almost an hour. It's supposed to be, hold on, it's 45 minutes, if you recall, that went out from the clerk, 45, and 30 minutes of business. Now, we've got business done now up to this point, but anyway. All right,
Witnesses.
I want to say thank you to Mr. Gotch and Mr. Shoemaker for providing their knowledge to the committee today as we start this study. And we'll sign off now and hopefully we'll see you again sometime in the future. So again, we'll suspend for a few moments to change out panels. The Yukon Fish and Game Association, Mr. Bryce Becker, President, for his opening statement. You have 5 minutes or less, sir. You're good to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, my name is Bryce Becker. I'm the president of the Yukon Fish and Game Association, the YFGA. It's a not-for-profit organization founded in 1945. I'm also the co-chair of the Carcross-Tagish Renewable Resource Council, founded under the Umbrella Final Agreements, and the affiliate director for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I've been an avid outdoorsman for as long as I can remember and have spent countless hours in the wilderness. As a child, I was taught by my parents and grandparents the importance of respecting wildlife and the wild places they live in. Since 1945, the YFGA has been an integral part of conservation-related items in partnership with so many stakeholders in their work. The Government of Canada, Government of Yukon, and First Nations are only a few. Successful reintroduction of wildlife into the Yukon would not have been possible without the help of the YFGA. Elk and bison have become a staple for many Yukon families. The Stock Lake programs have removed pressure from overfished lakes, and the YFGA was part of the initial inception of the requirement for a fishing license that was originally $2. Unfortunately, salmon are facing great challenges and an uncertain future in many parts of the world. The Yukon is not the only place we have heard where challenges and changes to the river and streams have resulted in declining fish stocks. BC has had their fair share of issues, as do our friends out east in Newfoundland. This is clearly a problem coast to coast. In all these cases, we can look at what might have happened to get us to the current situation and work on a plan to make things better going forward together. We've heard testimonies of what the Yukon River was like in the past, and it's clear that the Yukon River Chinook salmon are the salmon species in the most danger in the territory. A continuation of the current path will possibly lead to an extinction level circumstance in the upper Yukon River. Long-term population trends show that there are high and lows, but annually they continue to trend downward according to the records we've seen. The recent moratorium placed on the Yukon River Chinook salmon fishery April 1st, 2024 is a good start. While other watersheds like the LSEC show more promise in maintaining a sustainable Chinook population than the Yukon River does currently, there are many years documented showing the runs are cyclic there as well. The salmon are an intricate part of the bigger picture that has also been noted to the committee by many people. The nutrients placed back into the water system are beneficial to so many plants and animals along the shorelines. It is our responsibility to do what we can to ensure safe passage for the salmon traveling to and returning from the ocean. Man-made structures have been designed to an old standard and could possibly use a facelift. The studies have also shown that many of the tagged Chinook salmon came to the ladder and turned around. Those same studies showed that once the fish pass the viewing chamber, they have a very high success rate to keep going upstream. This also does not mean that they will spawn, as females were found to have most, or not all, of their eggs left from some carcass studies. While all this information is great, we're still not able to come to a conclusion why they turn around or do not place their eggs. We'd like to see the Government of Canada, the Government of Yukon work together with all Yukoners to do what we can to help these fish make their journey and, where necessary and possible, increase the number of fish returning to spawn. The YFGA has been advocating for wildlife since its inception with a holistic approach to wild places. We would like to work with all organizations to learn more about the current situation and help inform and motivate Yukoners on the importance of salmon in the ecosystem. Our youth will not care about the salmon if they do not know the importance to the ecosystem. Yukon Fish and Game Association will continue to be at the forefront of conservation, walking the walk like we have for almost 80 years. We believe that the 7-year moratorium will provide an opportunity to study and implement modern techniques to deal with the current problem. Habitat restoration and the correction of fish passage issues could be a few of the items the YFGA could effectively partner on. And I would like to thank you all for giving the Yukon Fish and Game Association and myself a chance to speak to you on this very important matter that resonates with most Yukoners. I also look forward to the day when we can look back and say we did that. We did everything we could to help bring this struggle population back from extinction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll now go to our rounds of question. I'll first go to Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Becker, for appearing today. Impressive history of the Yukon Fish and Game Association with the rehab and rehab restoration projects. Can you tell us how important fish and wildlife harvest is to all Yukoners? I think I'll just give you some time to elaborate on that a little more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Many Yukoners rely on the harvest from the land as their main staple for the table. Growing up, I moved here about 20 years ago and very quickly became involved with the Fish and Game Association. And many people like myself rely on hunting and fishing as their main source of food with the cost of living in the Yukon. Well, we've seen more recently, there's been a shift to more store-bought food, including salmon, without the ability to fish salmon. In my time in the Yukon, I don't remember when we could fish for salmon on the Yukon River. I've heard stories that they had them when I first got here, but unfortunately, I was unable to take part in those. Many Yukoners, again, like myself, don't have the ability to go back to the same historical level of where the fish were, where we could go down and catch fish. And we have seen demonstrations from the Canadian Wildlife Federation AGM last year in Whitehorse. And we also did, we've had presentations from the same at DFO for the Fish and Game Association. And the fish that were in those presentations are something that I can't even imagine that they were that big from my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Can you tell me how important it is for you and members like you to be able to put back into the resource so that it's there for future use?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was taught, as I mentioned before, by my family that being part of taking from the land also is a requirement to put back to the land. The time we've spent in partnership with groups like the Yukon Energy and the Salmon Fry Release up till recently, we were putting 10,000 fish back into the Wolf Lake Campground Creek, and we have recently moved that to about 2,500 into that same creek and moved 7,500 of those to a different location where they're more likely to make the return. This event gives us the ability to get children and families out to come and see the importance of fish. They get to release some little tiny fish back into the ocean or into the river that hopefully will eventually make the ocean. And it's an event that we can't even put into words how beneficial it is. And like I mentioned earlier, if the kids don't know how important the salmon are, I don't think that they're going to have respect for the salmon tomorrow.
Thank you. Can you tell me from your knowledge or possibly from the organization's history, has it become easier to participate in habitat restoration and habitat projects over the years, or has it become more difficult for organizations like you belong to participate in those fish and wildlife projects?
From the Fish and Game Association, we haven't been involved in as many of the projects. We do have our annual fry release at Wolf Creek, as I mentioned. In the past, we had programs like Friends of McIntyre Creek, where we would go and clean up the creek. That'll be coming back. Since 2020, we've had some real difficulties in the way that we operate, and are really looking at bringing things back like that. So Mr. Chair, it's gone both ways. It has been easier and more difficult in both instances. And under working with the federal government in my recent history, I don't remember being invited to participate in these. Through our partnerships at the Canadian Wildlife Federation, we do have the benefit of working with some very specialized people like Mr. Lapointe, who's was part of the study up here that worked with the First Nations and in looking at the way that the fish move through the ladder and up the Yukon River.
Would you be able to get back to the committee after consulting with your membership or possibly some of the previous executive to let us know whether it has whether there's been changes in the ability of the members to participate in conservation projects over the years?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can definitely do that. I will meet with our past executive director, who is a retiree from DFO, and our current executive director, who unfortunately can't be here today.
Okay, thank you. There's only about 45 seconds left. Anything further you'd like to add that I haven't asked about?
Yeah, I would just like to add that the Fish and Game Association has the ability to work with all user groups of the Yukon, and we would love to be part of the restoration of this salmon so that we can all look back, like I mentioned, and say that we did our best to try to bring these salmon back, and hopefully a good news story in the end.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and very good to see you, Bryce, on the screen, and thanks for appearing today. I want to first of all thank you for all the work that you and your colleagues do as an association. As Mr. Arnold said, there's a long and rich history to your organization, and you've done some great work. I want to start with because I didn't get a chance to ask this on the previous panel, and it may or may not be your area of expertise, but you mentioned the size of the salmon historically in previous decades, and now that we know that one of the factors is not just numbers, but it's the size and therefore spawning potential and survival potential of the fish. So, could you comment a bit further on how important that decline in size is as a contribution to the decline of the salmon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you mentioned, Mr. Hanley, it's not my area of expertise, but I have spent 16 years with the Yukon Fish and Game Association in a board member role, then vice president and president. From working with the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee and some of our other partners directly with salmon, it's my understanding that the largest fish historically were the ones that made it up the river. And I believe we've heard that, the committee has heard that in some of the past witnesses. The the nets that were used that were quite large over time got reduced to try to let the bigger ones go by. But that 3,200 kilometer stretch was always historically known to be the biggest fish that made it. And then the biggest fish, in also having the most energy by the time they got to the end, they also had the ability to spawn, maybe not better, but more of them would spawn, from what I understand, than they do today, as we've heard from a study that that was done from 2017 to 2020 with, sorry, I can't remember the names right now, but they did note that some of the fish that made it to the ladder, they turned around, they may have spawned right by the dam, they may not have. And then other carcass studies did show that some of the fish looked like they did not spawn at all, and others looked like they only spawned a bit and didn't finish spawning. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned that the Yukon River Panel new 7-year agreement is a good start. So, what else would you like to see as an association? Like, where now that we have the starting point, what else should be, whether that's within the panel agreement in terms of restoration, or whether there are other things not considered within this agreement that we should be addressing?
Sorry, I couldn't get my mic off mute. Thanks, Mr. Chair. We would like to, in the Yukon Fish and Game Association's history, we have always been out front as much as we can be in education. While the time that we can't fish today, we still would like to look at tomorrow. And the education side of that, I think the Fish and Game Association plays a vital role in where we can continue to educate and work with all of the partners across the entire country to improve, whether it's rounding up volunteers to do physical work, or it's getting educational pieces like Chinook salmon life cycles or something to work into the schools, or into just general conversations with members or the public. I think the Fish and Game Association would really like to be part of the solution and not sit on the sidelines in this very important issue.
Thank you. You mentioned the fish ladder, and it may be something we can come back to. Recognizing that the dam is very far upstream. In fact, not that far from the headwaters in the Teslin area. But what do you perceive as ways that we can mitigate the salmon passage in both directions at the dam?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but we do have partners that we can rely on to gather some of this information. We do understand from some of the recent reports that have been put in for the new water license that the fish coming to the ocean are just as important as the fish returning from the ocean. And I personally can't speak to what the numbers are that are making it through there, but the importance of them going both ways is our understanding is just they're both as important either way. And seeing the fish make it to the ocean, they've already got a lot of obstacles, as we've heard, with climate change and predation and dams and passage issues. So the bidirectional traveling of these fish, whether it's when they're going down as fry or coming back as adult spawning fish, is quite important. And again, we'd like to help in any way we can.
Thanks. I've got 15 seconds left, right? 12. I wonder, could you just briefly talk about the location apart from Wolf Creek where you're doing some of the new hatchery work?
Thank you, sir. Yes, so we've
or
moved.
Submit to the perhaps you could submit that in writing. I think the chair is strongly hinting at that.
Well,
I can do that, yeah.
Thank you for that, Mr. Hanley. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Non, mais je peux laisser quelques minutes à Monsieur.
I'd like to leave Mr. Hanley a few minutes to finish his answer. I think it's an important issue.
Okay, Bryce, I'll let you elaborate on. Actually, if I have a bit more time, merci beaucoup. I can ask you about just elaborate a little bit on the Wolf Creek project and then the recent steps that you've been taking and kind of I guess you're kind of moving away from Wolf Creek to a more successful area, but maybe talk about that more successful area.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the Yukon Fish and Game Association has partnered with Yukon Energy and the hatchery for as long as I can remember. I'm sure it predates my time. The Wolf Creek release has not shown, through tagged fish, from my understanding, has not shown the same return as we have seen in the Mitchie Creek area, where the spawning fish return in a lot more abundance. But through the Wolf Creek area, in bringing families and children, we bring out, again, like I said, 10,000 in the past, but about 2,500 more recently. We put on a barbecue and we talk about fish, and we talk about the importance of salmon in the ecosystem and the importance of salmon to both culturally and the biodiversity that they create. And moving to Mitchie Creek was the recommendation of the former hatchery manager, Lawrence Vanu, who has recently retired. And we look forward to working with YEC going forward. And they've really done a good job of looking at where the most likely the fish come back. And that was the reason for moving, from my understanding.
Mon petit chronomètre, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. So thank you very much for your answer. It's going to help me go on to my issues. It's very interesting to hear you talk about the families and to their awareness that you want to ensure to pass on knowledge and traditions, and how you deal with the protection of this resource. And has climate change, is that one of the major factors that affect this resource, or there are other factors as well that are important? And we've heard that these salmon is there predation as well in the as the salmon go back upriver?
Thank you, sir. Yes, thanks for your question. My understanding is the waters have changed over time, and with the changing in water temperatures can affect the travel of the fish, which could, again, not my area of expertise. We're just going off of what we've read and seen through various studies, and the change in water temperatures could be making the fish look at different spawning areas. It could also be bringing in disease that is not natural to the colder water. And on the predation side, the little tiny fish that are running up and down the Yukon River try to make it to the ocean so that they can survive for 5, 7, 8 years and come back. There's many factors in that, from otters to bigger fish, to northern pike and various things like that. As I mentioned earlier, the larger, older fish used to be the ones who made it back up, and in those cases, I would have to assume that a 80, 90-pound salmon would have less predators than a 10 or 20-pound salmon.
Je comprends, merci.
Thank you, I understand. What could you give the committee as factors for the basis of solid recommendations for the maintenance and the growth of this resource? Sorry,
I can't offer scientific recommendations, but from from the recommendations of us with boots on the ground, we're very much willing to work with all of our partners along the Yukon River to try to remove any of the obstacles. Fish Passage is one of the large ones that I've been reading about lately, and if a dam is unable for a fish to get over the dam, then obviously we don't see the fish make it back to where they're supposed to spawn, and vice versa. If they can't come back the other way, then they're not going to be able to return to the ocean. And by dams, I mean beaver dams and even changes in rivers that have happened due to the way the river flows. Maybe there's a washout or some permafrost heaves or something that have let go and changed the flow of the river. So any physical work is definitely something that the Fish and Game has the ability to round up people that love to get out and love to work towards improving the environment and working towards our generations for tomorrow, and make sure that they have all of the great things that we have today and enjoy these same resources and hopefully in abundance in the future.
Merci,
Thank
merci
you,
beaucoup.
Madam Debian.
Thank you very much.
Sharon, for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Becker, for being here. Thank you for all the responses that you've provided. I particularly appreciated your point talking about the importance of education and talking about how if you can't fish today, you need to look to tomorrow, and talking about wanting to go into schools and to being part of the solution. I think these are all such important points to be made at this time with this agreement in place and for us to be able to move forward. And one of the things I was thinking about was some of the work that we've done as a committee. We did one study on food labeling, on seafood labeling, and knowing how it was fished, where it's from, what's in the actual package, and so on. Because, as you said, many people are relying on grocery stores to purchase seafood now, and so on. And I'm wondering if that's something that comes to mind for you, and what you're seeing in the grocery stores. Is it clear when you're going to the grocery store what people are buying, if it's local, how it was, is it farmed, is it wild, is it local? Are these factors that are being taken into consideration or even available to those who are purchasing seafood in the grocery store?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't buy fish typically at the grocery store, but when I do walk by, my understanding is you'll see wild Atlantic salmon or wild Pacific salmon. I have not seen it specifically say whether they're farmed or not farmed or how they were caught. In the Yukon, we have a real benefit of being so close to Alaska. And with Alaska, the Yukon and Alaska have what's called a reciprocal fishing license. So in Alaska, you can come to the Yukon and you can purchase a fishing license for the same price as if you were a Yukon resident. Now in Alaska, we can do the same and go over and purchase a fishing license as if it was we were a Yukon resident, an Alaskan resident. From my experience, a lot of people that are looking for salmon in the Yukon they'll go down to either Haines, Alaska, or Skagway, Alaska, which is between an hour and a half or 4 hours, depending where you go, and try to harvest fish on their own, knowing where it came from, knowing how they caught it. I find that a lot of Yukoners really find it important to how they got their food, whether it's wild game or fish, and the ethics behind it, and also the harvesting in the most humane way.
Can't agree more. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on that education piece and whether you feel that that's an important piece of the work forward in making sure that that's talked about in schools, that there's that knowledge and that the generational learnings that are being passed on to youth in the Yukon. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more around the education piece.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, from the education perspective, in the absence of being able to fish and actually take your child out and sit on the side of a riverbank, and whether it's fly fishing or just traditional bait casting fishing, or in the First Nations perspective of netting fish, it's really hard to replace that being there. My kids have both grown up out on the land with us. They've both grown up, and they take these values with them. And with education, we can continue to bring that importance on while especially in this case of the Chinook moratorium. While we can't fish for Chinook, we still do have the ability to fish in other places, maybe not for Chinook salmon, but maybe sockeye if there's a good run somewhere. And the Yukon Fish and Game Association will work towards building with other partners, First Nations and other NGOs and government, on what is the best way. As we just heard from Mr. Gotch, that there is a First Nation looking at building. It's still early days. I haven't heard everything on it, but they're really trying to build something that focuses on the importance of fish and fish in culture and fish in the ecosystem and fish in just in general, how important they are. And through various seminars or I'm sorry, I can't think of the word right now, but little classrooms and stuff like that. We promote education on all species in the Yukon currently.
Thank you. I only have a minute left, so perhaps I'll ask you, one of the components of this agreement talks about, it says Alaska will continue to minimize incidental harvest of Chinook salmon in the fisheries in the main stem of the Yukon River and maintain efforts to reduce marine catches and bycatches of Yukon River origin Chinook salmon. I'm just asking because you were talking about how there's that reciprocal agreement in place. How realistic or what do you foresee as some of the challenges in specifically reducing Yukon River origin Chinook salmon as bycatch in these when people are out fishing?
Thank you. I believe personally it's difficult to reduce some of the bycatch as nets aren't selective. They're a lot like whatever comes in may not go out, but I can't really speak to the bycatch or the commercial fishery side. We've done a lot of research on the First Nations fishery and really support the way that the subsistence fishing goes. But I'm sorry, I can't speak much to the commercial side. We've heard the bycatch thing. It's one of those buzzwords out there, and I can't speak to how detrimental that is or not. Sorry.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. That kind of concludes the stretch. But what I would like to do, with the permission of the committee, is I believe Mr. Small or Mr. Arnold is up and Mr. Hardy. So I'll give one question there and one question to Mr. Hardy to finish off. Time is ticking. Well, it's not time, it's a question.
Question one. Since I have the floor, I'm going to move a motion. I'm going to move my motion that's put on notice with regard to the Elver fishery. As we know, there's been an issue in that the department claimed that they were closing the fishery so that they could arrest the supply chain of exporters and buyers, and none of those have been made, so I'd like to move.
Before you go on, Mr. Perkins, I'm going to let the witness go.
Sure.
So,
or if Mr. Kellaway wants to ask his question first before I do this, I'm
Mr.
fine
Kellaway
with that.
hasn't got a question. Mr. Hardy, though.
Yeah. I'm okay with that before I move the motion.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Hardy. Quickly, please.
Great, thank you. Mr. Becker, the hydroelectric dam seems to be, one pinch point, I suppose, in, both the travel and the survival of salmon, heading further east. In the absence of, better fish ladders and, better protection from, putting fish through the turbine, we had the big bar slide in British Columbia a couple of years ago now, and we used literally a water cannon to get fish past that barrier. Has that sort of thing been discussed? And secondly, with respect to the hatcheries, there have been great success in survivability and the size of recruits coming back when the fish are kept in the hatchery for an extra year before they're released. Have either of those two things been under discussion, through your group or through the network that you have?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From my understanding, sorry, I can't speak to the BC situation, but I have heard of the salmon cannon, and I have done a little bit of research personally on some alternative solutions. I can't speak to or make recommendations on the hydro dam currently. I think that we'd be better off left to the experts. I have heard the same, and maybe keeping a fish for an extra year could be very beneficial. I don't believe there's talks of that currently, but it is definitely something that we would be willing to work with Yukon Energy and all of their partners to again try to ensure the fish have the most survivability as they can. Not being we're not professionals in that. We can't really make a recommendation on how you operate a hydro dam either way.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, and I want to say a big thank you to Mr. Becker for sharing his knowledge with committee today as we start this Yukon salmon study. We're going to suspend for a moment now to go into committee in camera.
Into committee. My motion was, okay,
well, you can wait then, because the last half hour is dedicated to committee business.
No, the agreement
the email was sent out. The email was sent out. Rick, you got an email.
Let me finish a sentence. Don't be rude, Mr. Chair. I politely gave Mr. Hardy my slot when I had the floor so they could ask the question so I can get back to this, and I think you owe me the courtesy and respect to allow that back while we're still in open committee.
Okay, you got 3 minutes.
Okay, so I've got 3 minutes. So as we know, the government closed the Alver fishery, claiming that by doing that they could arrest and charge people who are exporting illegally and the buyers, and none of that has happened. There is poaching going on in every river in Nova Scotia every night. There have been some token arrests, but nowhere near enough. And the minister owes it to allow the Alver harvesters to earn a living, the 1,100 people she's deprived, while others continue to steal that resource out of the river. So I'm going to move the following motion that regarding Minister Dan, and it's on notice, that regarding Minister Diane Leboutilier's decision to close the legal Alver harvest of 2024, the committee finds that A, banning legal fishing does not stop poaching, B, closing the Alver fishery has not decreased criminal activity and violence in Nova Scotia as evidenced by the witnesses who have come forward to this committee to detail continued violence and lawlessness in their communities, including arson, assault, and attempted murder. C, closing the Alver fishery has resulted in 1,100 job losses, harming rural Nova Scotian communities and the fishing industry as a whole, when Canadians are struggling with the cost of living crisis created by this government. And D, that current DFO and RCMP enforcement efforts allocated by the minister to remain insufficient and have not put a halt to the violence or the poaching. And given that these findings, the committee therefore agrees to report these findings to the House and call on the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard to immediately reopen the Alver fishery.
Mr. Galloway.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to put forward an amendment if possible. And I'll do something different this time. I will speak to the changes or relay the changes to everyone here and then read the motion out with the changes so it's a bit clearer for everyone. So I'd like to amend the motion in the following way. So number one, by deleting A and replacing it with the following, that the Alver fishery is a unique public safety and law enforcement environment with considerations including Indigenous treaty rights to fish that complicate attempts to stop unauthorized fishing. 2, deleting B. 3, delete create by this government in bullet C. 4, delete bullet D and replacing it with the following. The Federal Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Provincial Ministers of Public Safety, Justice and Fisheries and Aquaculture are working hard and in collaboration across jurisdictions to ensure that public safety is maintained in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick this Alver season. Number 5, delete, quote, and call on the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard to immediately reopen the Alver fishery, end quote, and replace it with the following, quote, that this committee call on the government to accelerate the adoption of new regulations for the Alver fishery so that the 2025 season can open as scheduled. So I'll read out the motion with the changes and then I'll circulate it in both official languages if it's not already done so. That regarding Minister Diana Boutilier's decision to close the legal Elver harvest of 2024, the committee finds that A, that the Elver fishery is a unique public safety and law enforcement environment with considerations including Indigenous treaty rights to fish that complicate attempts to stop unauthorized fishing. B, closing the Elver fishery has resulted in 1,100 job losses, harming rural Nova Scotian communities and the fishing industry as a whole when Canadians are struggling with a cost of living crisis. D, the Federal Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Provincial Ministers of Public Safety, Justice and Fisheries and Aquaculture are working hard in collaboration across jurisdictions to ensure that public safety is maintained in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick this Elver season. And given these findings, the committee therefore agrees to report these findings to the House, that this committee call on the government to accelerate the adoption of new regulations for the Elver fishery so that the 2025 season can open as scheduled.
Debate.
I would ask the chair to rule this out of order because it actually goes diametrically in the opposite direction of the intent of the original motion. The original motion calls for the season to open, not for the season to remain closed. Those are complete opposites and therefore out of order. It's also out of order because the motion clearly identifies that the government has done an inadequate job of enforcing the law, and it claims to do the exact opposite. So in both cases, what the government is doing is out of order and against the spirit and intent of the original motion. It is a completely opposite motion to this and therefore out of order.
Okay, I'll rule that it's not out of, what?
Oh, no, I think you should discuss it with the clerk before that.
Be in order, and the other option is that members who don't think it's in order could vote against it and vote it down. Mr. Arnold.
I challenge the chair's position on this. The amendment is definitely contrary in an exact opposite direction to the original motion. This proposed amendment should not be allowed to, it should be declared out of order.
Duly noted. Mr. Small.
So it's a challenge the chair.
So, go to a vote.
Proceed to a vote on the challenge to the chair.
Okay. Proceed to a vote on the challenge to the chair. Madam Clerk. You challenge the chair to ruling. Yep.
So what's a yes and what's a no?
Yes is in favor of the challenge. No is not in favor of the challenge. Only a yes and no answer.
Yes is to uphold the chair, no is to over, the other way around. Is the other way.
Yes is to uphold the challenge. Agreeing with the challenge to the chair?
Right, is a yes.
Is a yes? Okay.
Yeah, well, since I have one then. Okay, I'll ask the clerk to do the vote.
So to sustain the decision of the chair?
No, that's right. Challenge to the chair. They're either in favor of the challenge to the chair or against the challenge to the chair. So a no vote is saying they're not in favor of the challenge. A yes vote is saying they're agreeing with the challenge. Right?
Confer with the clerk.
To sustain, it's yes.
Sustain the is a yes.
The decision. To sustain the decision.
To sustain the decision,
Yes.
yes.
To negate the challenge to the chair. Because he made the decision that it's in order. To sustain that decision, we have to say yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Is it all clear?
Like
As mud, but it covers the
mud.
ground.
I don't get the vote, so I don't care which way it goes. Yeah, that'd be good, wouldn't it?
Yes is to sustain the chair, no is to overrule the chair. Is that what the clerk is recommending?
Yeah. No is to overrule, yes is to sustain.
So just to be clear, Voting yes.
Écoute, là, à un
Okay,
moment donné...
order. Come on, we got to try and get some business done.
Okay, so if you vote yes, you keep the ruling. If you say no, the decision is overturned. Monsieur Cormier,
So I vote yes to sustain the decision of the chair.
Mr. Hanley,
Likewise, I vote yes.
Mr. Hardy,
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway,
Yes.
You had to think about it.
Mr. Morrissey, Mr. Arnold,
No, I challenge the chair.
Mr. Epp,
No.
Mr. Perkins,
No, I don't support the chair's ruling.
Mr. Small,
No.
Madame Desbiens,
Je m'abstiens.
Ms. Barron,
What did she say? Qu'est-ce qu'elle a dit? Oh, wow.
She said abstain.
So, I had it. So, sorry. So no.
no?
Yes.
There's a tie, so it's your vote. It's your decision.
So I got to vote.
But it's in order.
All right, so I guess I got to break the tie.
Do you agree with yourself?
I agree with myself, yes. Why wouldn't I agree with myself? I figure I'm always right. Just ask Trudy that if you ever bump into her. Yes, yeah. Yes. I know, that don't happen very often.
Well, you know.
Only in the house. Yeah.
We can resume debate.
Okay, we'll resume debate now on the amendment. Mr. Kellaway.
Okay. I saw some hands go up, but I think I'm good to go. Just to speak to the amendment, the committee had already decided to send a letter to the minister at the conclusion of the study, Mr. Chair, and the motion, I think, in question goes against what the committee, the subcommittee, I mean, agreed to and the direction to take. There's nothing in this motion that could not be included in the letter to the minister. I think our amendments, they introduce some important context back into the motion. It absolutely requires an acknowledgement of the interplay of an unauthorized fishery and the exercise of Indigenous rights. I also want to point out that...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. With all respect to my colleague...
Mr. Henley.
With all respect to my colleague, Mr. Kenny, I wonder if we could let our poor witness...
Yes, Mr. Becker,
out of
you're
the room.
free to leave whenever you like, please. Sign off whenever you like. Thank you for appearing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Yeah, and anything that you want to send us in writing in relation to the questions you were asked, please submit it in writing so as we can include it in this study. So again,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody.
thank you.
Thank you for that call on letting the witness go. The motion, to a large degree, I believe, ignores what makes the fishery so hard to manage, and it's issues like nighttime fishing and the sheer amount of rivers in Nova Scotia that have to be patrolled on a daily basis by law enforcement, and the danger of law enforcement, what they have to go through on a daily basis. So when I think of the subcommittee's direction, I think we had a pretty good meeting with respect to the subcommittee. I think we have a really excellent go forward in terms of the letter. And my understanding is the letter doesn't have to be your standardized one-page letter. It can be detailed with recommendations, thoughts, observations. And so, I think we need to give some thought into the role of the subcommittee, what it puts forward, knowing that we have to pivot sometimes, but this seems to be already covered in the original motion.
Thank you. Mr. Kellaway keeps referring to the subcommittee. The subcommittee had no discussions on this motion whatsoever.
No, I'm talking about in general our direction of how we want to handle meetings, MP Arnold, and through you, Chair, and that's what we discussed quite a lot. in fact. So we didn't talk specifically, but we certainly talked about generalities and how we want to work together to make things happen, like studies, more studies, and for all folks that have a special stake in things that are important to them, MP Debian, MP Barron, and you folks on the Conservative side. So we certainly talked about the general paths forward, and I think that's important to highlight. So with that in mind, I mean, I think that, again, I think we have the mechanism by which to address what we heard was powerful testimony. What we heard was an incredible ordeal that is happening last year. We also should actually acknowledge, too, that this year there have been considerable amount of arrests. And there have been considerable amount of vehicles being taken away from owners. So I think we need to be very thoughtful here in terms of providing the full picture to get the results that we want. And I think the original path forward is absolutely the way to go. And it's the most prudent way to go. And perhaps it is even the most efficient way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. Mr. Small?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with all due respect to Mr. Kellaway, you know, he spoke about the vast geography, the number of rivers, the amount of darkness. It's the same as it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago before that fishery even began, Mr. Speaker. Nothing's changed with respect to the number of rivers and the hours of daylight. But, you know, and I understand Mr. Kellaway's point of view. He's here to protect his minister. We're here on this side
point of
to
order,
stand
Mr.
up
Speaker.
for the Elver harvesters.
May I make a point of order? Sure. It is really interesting that a lot of committees, and one like this that was so, to a large degree, nonpartisan, how quickly it becomes partisan when you say that I'm trying to protect the minister. So when you defame the person, your argument is toast.
It's not a point of order. That's debate.
So, Mr. Speaker,
you're supposed to rule things out of order, Mr. Chair, if they're not a point of order.
I'll rule them out of order when I think they're out of order, Mr. Perkins.
Well, then sitting there grinning at him while he's not
nobody
making a point of
recognised
order.
you didn't speak, and you're speaking.
Yes, I am.
So there's nobody chastising you for it?
You're not enforcing the rules, Mr. Chair.
Oh, you're going to see the rules enforced going forward, let me tell you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Small?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And when we had the harvesters here about a month or so ago, I guess, and I asked the Elver harvesters themselves, would it be possible to salvage some kind of a season around mid-April or even towards the end of April? Because oftentimes the Elver fishery continues up towards the end of June. So, and Mr. Kellaway earlier, and I'll quote, said that considerable amounts of arrests have been made. So with such success in arresting poachers on those rivers, maybe it's a good time to evaluate the success of the enforcement that's happened so far and to give the fishery a shot, because those 1,100 jobs could be partially saved this year. And there's another thing, Mr. Speaker. When you pull out of a market, when you pull seafood out of a market, someone else comes in with their seafood and takes your market, and you may not get it back, Mr. Speaker. This is very serious. So if there's any way to have a partial season going forward and make a decision quickly, I mean, I've heard a lot of positive things coming out of the minister's office, quite optimistic about the number of arrests that were made. So I'm thinking they must have a lot of the poaching cleaned up based on what we're hearing. So why not give these harvesters a chance to go and make some kind of a living, Mr. Chair?
I think too, sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, there was Kellaway and Small on the list there.
And I waved at you about 3 times and you acknowledged it.
Yeah, you said what you had to say to me.
No.
Oh.
That wasn't it.
Okay, go ahead.
Otherwise, you let me
go ahead, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. Good to see the enforcement of rules so clearly. Mr. Chair, so on the issue of the actual motion, which is a complete reversal of the motion that I originally proposed in spite of the vote of this committee, the fact is that this original motion and this motion do the opposite. This motion claims they're actually doing the job. And as we've heard from Elver harvesters, apparently you were listening, but you didn't hear it, that the enforcement isn't happening to the level that needs to stop the poaching at any level of the supply chain. This motion I will not support because it actually says that the government, the Liberal government, Liberal Fisheries Minister number 6, is doing as good a job as Liberal Fisheries number 4 and 5 on this, when this has been going on for 10 years, and number 4 and number 5 and number 6 have screwed up this fishery for 10 years, increasing poaching, and they keep trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. They keep closing the fishery, thinking that will take poachers off the river, when all it does is allow for a free reign. And there is no enforcement after 1 a.m. on the rivers in Nova Scotia. DFO has no enforcement officers on the river. They're pulled off at 1 to 1:30 every bloody night. And that's when the lawlessness happens. That's when the shots are fired into people's houses. That's when people are terrorized by the criminal organizations doing this. Yet all the government wants to do is say the legal harvesters should stay off the river to some mythical regulations because the criminals doing this will be afraid of regulations. There's a Fisheries Act now and licensed harvesters now that the department can enforce the law on. All they have to do is enforce the law, which we've been asking for years, in which the government and the officers remain under-resourced and unable to enforce, or we wouldn't have the massive crime happening in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia right now because of the incompetence of Liberal Fisheries Ministers number 4, 5, and 6. And this committee is going to try and reinforce the fact that they think that with all this lawlessness going on, with all this crime going on, with all this poaching going on, with not one single exporter, with not one single buyer having been arrested to date, that somehow we should throw flowers at the minister for trying
point
hard.
Of order, Mr. Speaker.
Trying hard, it's ridiculous.
The social media clip is unfolding as it should, but to say
No,
that
I'm sorry you're
talking
embarrassed
about
by your
flowers and
performance.
taking the high ground that they're the only people that care about Alver fishers and
Well,
the
then
Alver
do
industry
something about
is
it.
absolutely
Then do
atrocious.
something about it for a
speaks well
change.
like the classic
Actually
right-wing
do
pivot points
something for
that
a
only
change.
they could care about fishers, only they could care about the fishery. It is absolutely ridiculous and quite offensive.
Well, if you care about
quite
it, enforce
offensive.
the law for a
Quite
change.
offensive,
For
Mr.
us,
Chair.
that's what's offensive. And that's the point of debate, which the chair let it go on again.
Point of order.
That's a point of debate.
Excuse me, colleagues.
Ms. Barron has the floor.
My point of order is that we have members who are both yelling into the microphone at the same time, which is impacting translators, and I would ask my colleagues to please be aware of the important work happening by the translators and to please take turns and wait to be addressed by the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. Mr. Morrissey. Oh, you turned it off.
Thank you, Chair. And I do, obviously, as we're seeing here, this is a very emotional situation, which triggers a very emotional debate. I support the amendment. My concern is there has not been presented any evidence to this committee that would ensure that a reopening of a fishery can be adequately, properly, and safely enforced. The reason this decision was taken was in line with a situation, a parallel situation in Maine, where they had to completely shut down the Alver fishery for a period of time to regain control. And control is a broad term because you must have the regulations and the methodology in place to actually enforce a very difficult fishery. Alvers do not come with barcodes on them. So once somebody has it, you have to have the ability and the proper regulations to charge somebody for an illegal. And we heard extensively from department officials about the necessity to have the proper regulations in place, Mr. Chair, to enforce the fishery. What's being done today is to ensure there's a future for this fishery for the people involved, which includes First Nation people in Nova Scotia and to a lesser extent in New Brunswick. So at this stage, I support the action taken by the minister to gain control of a very dangerous situation, which a lot of it, let's be clear, a lot of it is outside the scope. The alleged criminal activity is outside of the scope of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Simple items like trespassing is not enforceable by DFO. It's the provincial police. The provincial police in Nova Scotia, by contract, is the RCMP, who should be enforcing more visibly a lot in those areas. So to simply, I cannot support a motion that would direct the minister to reopen a fishery that I am still not convinced or assured that it can be conducted in a safe manner for those involved, as well as to ensure the long-term stability of this fishery, which is what all the regulations that are being considered has been put in place. So, Mr. Chair, I do welcome the amendments of my colleague, and which still brings a degree of urgency to the situation that this committee is studying. It reinforces it strongly, and that's why, Mr. Chair, I thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to be pretty brief here. So the main difference between Mr. Perkins' motion and Mr. Kellaway's amendments to the motion is that Mr. Perkins is asking for an opening of the fishery here in 2024 to give the harvesters and all the folks who take advantage of the spin-offs from the industry to be able to salvage something of this season. Mr. Kellaway's motion is to keep the season closed this year. So I support my colleague, Mr. Perkins' motion to open the season this year and not to have it closed for the full season, because we may not even get it open in 2025. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we're running out of time.
Huh?
And we're running out of time.
Okay, sorry. My inner Rick Perkins is really as anxious about the whole issue, the lawlessness that's keeping, honest people away from the living that they want to pursue. So I share your frustration. I'm just, I hold it in here. I don't let it out as much as some others might.
I think I have my inner.
Yeah, but at the same time, opening the fishery, we don't know what the current level of illegal fishing is actually doing to the stock. I mean, I don't know the Elver fishery at all, but I'm wondering if, illegal fishery on top of the illegal one, which, let's face it, I think we all agree that whatever improvements have been made in enforcement still isn't enough to deal with the sheer mass volume of illegality that's taking place. But I don't know what opening up the legal fishery would do to the stock, the health of the stock. The other thing is that, we've gone through the IUU study, and we've studied the Elver fishery, and in both cases, we've identified the fact that the enforcement efforts, the contribution from the province through the RCMP has been almost non-existent, and we understand that that's because the local RCMP members are just as bloody afraid of what's going on in the river as everybody else is. So I think that, if we're going to really get serious about the whole issue of enforcement, we have to have a discussion on the actual enforcement strategy, where the resources come from. I don't think that they can come from the community itself. So, what's the state of the stock? What kind of enforcement strategy is really going to be necessary to get a handle on this? I think we need to get that done before we even consider opening up even more taking of Elver from those rivers in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Mr. Hardy, we'll go to Ms. Barron now for the last 30 seconds. Or a minute. I can't see what the clock is actually on.
Yeah, I
Barron?
mean, I have some points I was going to make, but we have 30 seconds or a minute left. So what happens now? So at this point, when this minute is up, what happens with this? Is this carried to the next meeting? What's the
Yes.
process here?
Is it?
Okay. So in that
It
case, I'll
adjourns.
just wait till the next meeting, and then we can continue the debate.
If I could, I just want to apologize to the, on my behalf anyway. I think my inner Mick Kellaway met the inner Rick Perkins today, and I apologize to MP Debian and the translators for speaking over other individuals. That's not becoming, and I apologize for that.
Same here, Mr. Chair.
Yes, our time is up, so,
5:35.
but I want to ask the committee, do they want us to suspend and pick this up or adjourn?
Our meeting started at 3:34. We should be going to 3:34, or 5:34. I have only 5:30 and 20 seconds. I move that we adjourn debate on the amendment and vote on the amendment.
Okay,
On his amendment first.
you can't do that.
Chair, I had made a motion to adjourn
Yes, clerk.
the meeting.
Clerk said you can't do it. Okay, can you explain to Mr. Reynolds why he can't do that?
You cannot move to force a vote, but you can move to adjourn if you don't include anything else in the motion.
Okay. Well, Bring us to 5:34 to please everyone.
Je voulais juste m'assurer que j'aurais un droit de parole.
I just wanted to ensure that I would have a right to take the floor because I haven't spoken yet, and I would like to have an opportunity to do that.
Mr. Arnold? Point of order?
Meeting?
Oh, okay. I apologize for that.
Yes, because
heard
I
it?
said
Okay.
it was 5:30. That was my prerogative.
Yeah, and that's what was sent out by notice, but somebody
Yeah.
pointed out we were 4 minutes late starting.
But my motion was in order. Was it right?
Yes.
Would you right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Meeting adjourned.